You would think from its name that the supplier preferencing matrix would be a classification scheme for us to rank suppliers like the order that we preferred them. The name is deceptive. The supplier preferencing matrix is a categorization scheme, but it allows us to picture how the suppliers would see us. So it's really about whether they would prefer us or not. All right, now, why don't we look at an example? The day shift manager of Field of Greens decides that a close partnering arrangement for fresh vegetables. Yes, we had been discussing earlier with supplier positioning that that's highly appropriate. Okay, 4 potential fresh vegetable suppliers are. Now notice, these are suppliers that the small business Field of Greens might choose to supply fresh vegetables. Let's look at the descriptions. Global Fruit Supplies is a very large company supplying food processing plants, supermarket chains, and other high-volume institutional buyers. Oh, okay. Total Veg Inc. is a vegetable wholesaler similar to Global Fruit Supplies. Okay, they're just not as big. Fresh Veggies Inc. is a multinational company specializing in delivery of fresh vegetables directly to restaurant kitchens. That's good. Field of Greens is a restaurant. All About Veg LLC is a local company that partners with nearby farms to offer freshly picked vegetables. Okay, like the larger Fresh Veggies, it specializes in deliveries directly to commercial kitchens. That's good. Right now, where would each of these suppliers fall within the so-called supplier positioning matrix? And there is a blank matrix or model for us to work with. Notice what we're going to do. We're going to take each one of those 4 and we're going to find the appropriate category that they belong to. In doing that, though, the questions that we're asking in each case is not how do we see the supplier, not our opinion of them. The question is we're imagining how the supplier sees us, and that's what determines the category. All right, now, let me explain. We've got 2 questions we have to ask in the case of each supplier. One is, you can see this across the bottom of the matrix, the value of Field of Greens business. This refers to how the supplier views the value of Field of Greens business. Okay, so Field of Greens is looking for a partner to supply fresh vegetables because they're a vegetarian restaurant. So they're going to be buying so many fresh vegetables a year, so many thousands of dollars, $100,000 worth of fresh vegetables. Does a supplier think that that amount of money, that amount of business is a lot of business? That's a lot of business to them? Then we would want to locate them over towards the right. Is that nothing to them, right? Small fry, drop in the bucket. Oh, well, then we would want to locate them closer to the left. All right, now that's just left to right where to categorize the supplier. What about up and down? It says attractiveness of account. And you're probably thinking, oh, well, weren't we just talking about attractiveness of account? Whether a supplier would think that Field of Greens' overall amount of purchasing in fresh vegetables is attractive or not. Attractiveness of account, the vertical axis in the supplier preferencing matrix, is meant to refer to essentially everything other than money. Because there are other issues that a supplier would take into account. Think about it like compatibility. I mean, just loosely speaking, compatibility. Because, for instance, you say, well, I don't know, what kind of stuff are you looking for? You would like to buy something, somebody supplies it, but are you the usual kind of business that they supply to? Because if you're not the usual kind of business that they supply to, they may not be, for instance, set up to do that kind of delivery, and you're becoming like less attractive account, right? You're not as logistically convenient to them. Or maybe you're otherwise a very attractive account, but here's something else that may factor into it. You're way outside their service area. From their perspective, you know, all their other clients, you're on the other side of the state. Okay, you're definitely then, even if you're offering a lot of money, becoming a less attractive account just because you're outside their service area. This is the sort of thing we're looking for. Okay, now, these are questions that we ask. We're trying to imagine what each supplier is thinking. Let's go to the first one. Global Fruit Supplies. First question, value of Field of Greens business. Global fruit supplies. Field of Greens is a single vegetarian restaurant. This is a, first off, very large company. Okay, right away, now we don't have a whole lot of information, but notice this also says high volume buyers. Right away, we're getting some very strong hints that this Global Fruit Supplies probably, right, isn't going to be impressed with the value of Field of Greens business simply because, from what little we know about them, they deal with much larger organizations. All right, now that doesn't make them a bad supplier, but it does mean that we're going to want to, on this matrix, locate them more over to the left, right? They're used to dealing with more money and bigger buyers. All right, now up versus down, attractiveness of the account. There's something I notice in the description of Global Fruit Supplies, right? Very large company supplying food processing plants, supermarket chains, institutional buyers. I don't see restaurants mentioned, let alone small businesses and single restaurants. This is exactly the kind of not so compatible factor or effect that would crop up. So as far as locating Global Fruit Supplies up and down, it's not appropriate to locate them low on the matrix because they're also used to dealing with completely different kinds of businesses. Right, that means that, let's see, they're going to consider us not very attractive, or actually I should say it is appropriate to consider them low because not a very attractive account, not very much money. They're right here. Global Fruit. Not very compatible, not very attractive. Oh, and see what it's labeled? But we'll get back to the interpretation later. This sector is labeled nuisance. Gee, I wonder why. Okay, now let's work with the other three. Total Veg Inc. Let's see, a vegetable wholesaler similar to Global Fruit Supplies, right? So sort of like copy paste. You can assume all these other things are true, although not as large. Okay, similar to Global or Fruit Supplies means that they will have that same attitude about the attractiveness of the account, because we said we could assume all that other stuff, so they must be selling to food processing plants and supermarket chains and stuff. Not as large means that the value of Field of Greens business, but in proportion to their overall business, is going up. So I would argue that Total Veg Inc. is probably more appropriate. It should be on the same level as Global Fruit Supplies, but it is more appropriate to locate it more towards the right. And so we'll put it right there. And notice it says exploitable. Well, we'll come back to that. Next one, Fresh Veggies Inc. Okay, Fresh Veggies Inc., a multinational company. All right, again, the size of the supplier tells you a lot about, generally, just really fast, the likelihood of their perception of the value of the buyer's business. We're back to multinational, we're back to really large, which means that, well, we would be back towards the left here in that they're not going to be as impressed with Field of Greens business. Specializing in the delivery of fresh vegetables directly to restaurant kitchens, though, there's a difference. Like Global Fruit Supplies, they're not likely to be that impressed with the value of Field of Greens business because Field of Greens is so small, but they are much more friendly in terms of compatibility, attractiveness of the account. They are in the business of delivering to restaurant kitchens, which is exactly what Field of Greens is looking for, a partner to do that. Oh, okay. So that means kind of like the same column as Global Fruit Supplies because they're so big, but we do want to locate them higher on the matrix. So we say, well, Fresh Veggies Inc. They'd be in this, it says develop. All right, fine, develop category. And then finally, we get to All About Veg, Limited Liability Corporation. Okay, a local company that partners with nearby farms. This is a smaller business. So a smaller business in proportion to Field of Greens business does mean that they should be located more to the right, especially compared to the likes of these two. Okay, more to the right. Like the larger Fresh Veggies Inc., which we located up here, they specialize in delivery directly to commercial kitchens. That means that in terms of up and down, they should be located along the same level as Fresh Veggies Inc. Field of Greens would be an attractive account. All right, all about veg then. That's where they wind up. Okay, they're smaller, so they consider the value of Field of Greens business to be greater. They have the same very positive attitude about the attractiveness of the account, because that's exactly the business they're in, is supplying restaurants. Oh, all right. So we've used the supplier preferencing matrix to classify each of these 4 potential suppliers that Field of Greens is looking at for a partner in fresh vegetables. Notice that in this note frame, there's one last question. It says, what does this suggest the manager should do? Yeah, like, well, okay, this is good, but why did we do this, right? What are we supposed to use this for now? All right, what this suggests is that, first and foremost, it says core manager should approach all about veg LLC first. And the whole purpose of this scheme is, again, to shake out who winds up in the upper right, because we don't necessarily know that that will become your supply chain partner. But the theory is they're the most promising candidates of all of them. So start there first, right? About, looking into striking up a relationship between that. That overall would be is the most promising candidate for Field of Greens. Now, that doesn't mean that the manager has to confine his or her energies to just courting all about veg. Fresh Veggies Inc., right here under develop, is sort of still potentially a candidate for partnership. Fresh Veggies Inc. would be a good supply chain partner for Field of Greens, particularly if Fresh Veggies Inc. thought that Field of Greens, the restaurant, was going to grow in the future. Fresh Veggies Inc., if you will recall, okay, is a much, much bigger company. So they're used to much, much bigger accounts. But why would they bother to invest energy in a close partnership with Field of Greens, which is just this one vegetarian restaurant? They might actually be very enthusiastic about that prospect if they suspected that Field of Greens was later going to become a chain and become a much bigger client. So it's possible, okay? But definitely first start with all about veg. Also, another use, say, well, what should the manager do? What this scheme is basically to take a bunch of candidates and to shake them out, right? Who's the most promising, and definitely who to forget. Why do they call the lower left-hand category nuisance? Because it's not that Field of Greens thinks that Global Fruit Supplies is a nuisance. Remember, it's all about Global Fruit Supplies, because Global Fruit Supplies is likely to only think of this single restaurant, Field of Greens, as a nuisance. You might as well just forget about them right now. It is not likely that they would be a very good answer as your partner for fresh vegetables. Likewise, a little bit less so, but likewise, that one last category, Total Veg Inc. Total Veg Inc., if the manager were to approach them, might be, one would expect, a little bit friendlier towards Field of Greens, because they're somewhat smaller, and so the value of Field of Greens business would be bigger. Okay, but beware. See how that sector is labeled exploitable? We're not talking, like if we were Field of Greens, we're not talking about exploiting Total Veg Inc. That label is referring to the fact that danger, Total Veg Inc. may look upon Field of Greens as an opportunity to exploit. Really what's going on is Field of Greens likes the value of the business, Total Veg Inc. likes the value of the business, right? They're over to the right. but doesn't consider the account real attractive. Like, oh, that would be bothersome. We don't normally deal with restaurants, although we like the look of that money. Therefore, we'll give you a not particularly good price. This is what we mean by exploitable, just to see if you'll take it. If you'll take it, then we'll go ahead and we'll put up with you as a restaurant, right? But if you don't like the price, if you start asking for concessions, right, or for more value added because you want a closer partner and we just don't feel like doing that, we being Total Veg Inc., we're not going to be real open to making those concessions. We don't really care if we lose your account again because we don't really consider your account all that attractive. So remember, we're talking about what should the day shift manager at Field of Greens do, and the supplier preferencing matrix is suggesting that essentially, yeah, you know, unless you're really running out of options, Total Veg Inc. probably isn't a very good answer either.